You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia. My name is Breach Burke. I'm your host for this podcast. This week what we are going to talk about this is part 2 of I guess you could call it a mini-series, on the goddess Hecate, who is the queen of witches, queen of the underworld. She's associated with crossroads, magic, witchcraft, ghosts. And as I mentioned in the last podcast, she's probably one of the most, I guess you could call her one of the most liminal deities. I just will mention quickly that after we are done talking about Hecate, next month we're going to take a turn and look at some deities and folklore figures from outside of the Greek and Roman realm, which is mainly where I've been working right now. And in the Near East, mainly because, I've been trying to kind of keep things geographically themed or together. But since October is a extremely liminal month, associated with Halloween, with the thinning of the veil between the worlds, I thought it might be appropriate to cover 2 other topics. And 2 topics in particular that we're going to cover next month are Baba Yaga, the witch from Slavic folklore, and also the Morrigan, the Irish goddess of war, who's also associated with the gates of the underworld and with other, she has other liminal associations as well. So that's just a little prelude that I wanted to throw in there. I didn't want to forget by the end of the episode, because usually I get so into what I'm talking about, and then at the end I go, oh, darn, I really wanted to mention that. So anyway, so moving back to Hecate. I mentioned in the last episode the possibility of 6 Hecates, okay? And I'll just kind of repeat what I have in my notes about that. One is the sort of Anatolian goddess associated with Lagina and the temples there in Karina, which was, now it's in modern Turkey, but was Asia Minor, the Anatolian area of that time. And again, there's overlap between all of these Hecates. They're not mutually exclusive. She's been a goddess of childbirth, who's also associated with Apollo, Helios, the sun god. Both of them have had attributes as sun gods, and of course the goddess Artemis. There's the Hecate of the Hesiod and the Homeric hymns. Okay, so she is the one who is considered, Hesiod talks about in very glowing terms as, being highly respected by Zeus and having her share of the earth, sky, and sea. Okay. This is a figure that is, and it surprises a lot of scholars because the later versions of Hecate are not quite so, they don't seem quite so beneficent, let's put it that way. And we talked about those in the last episode, so that's just sort of a brief recap. If you want to go back over that territory, go back to the previous podcast and have a listen. So this particular episode, I want to talk about the other sort of 3 aspects of Hecate. One is her as a sort of what I would call a Middle Platonic and Neoplatonic savior figure, Hekate Soteria, which is also part of her Anatolian aspect, by the way. But but it's specifically, it's actually quite a critical shift, I guess you could say, in the way of thinking about Hecate, and also the way that we think about life after death. I mean, she's actually an extremely pivotal figure, in how we our change in thinking about the underworld and what it is, from the sort of, general, well, you're dead and you all go to the same place, to this sort of more ethically oriented idea that one could be saved from death through certain behaviors or certain practices and so forth, which later came to sort of more modern ideas about salvation in Western religion. Okay, so that's a very important concept, and I'm probably going to spend most of my time on that. But there is this idea of her queen of witches and ghosts and at the crossroads, and of course the connected that is the triple Hecate, or the goddess Trivia, or Diana Trivia. Again, Diana and Artemis are similar. Artemis is the Greek version. Diana tends to be the Romanized Artemis, whatever other attributes she may have. And Trivia, in this case, was associated with both Hecate and Artemis, Hecate and Diana, and has to do, again, with that triple crossroads aspect. So I'm going to talk about all of these things. This is sort of my next thing. So again, I have some notes here, and I've tried to keep it succinct. So last time we ran to about an hour, and I'd like to make it a little shorter this time. But some important stuff to go over here with regard to Hecate. Okay, so if we kind of look at the I'm going to say like the late classical Hellenistic period of Greece, we're talking 5th century, 4th century BCE, and onward 3rd century. The time of Alexander the Great is the later part in the Macedonian Empire. Okay, you see a prominence of Greek philosophy at this time. And as I mentioned in my new book, Death and the Maiden, I have a whole chapter on Pythagoras, Zoroaster, and Zoroastrianism, and Orphism. And how these end up, the influences of these, and just to be sort of cautious about that, there's a lot that's still uncertain about how these religions were practiced or what was believed, particularly Zoroastrianism. Okay, there's a lot we don't know about that, and certainly the way the Greeks practiced Zoroastrianism is probably not the way Persian Zoroastrians practiced, or maybe it was. We don't entirely know. But when it comes to so from this period of time, we're starting to have a different way of thinking about religion. Okay, now Hecate appears as a triple goddess after. Now this is I have a number of sources I've pulled from here. Of course, I've pulled from Sarah Iles Johnston, but not Restless Dead this time. She has a work called Hekate Soteria, which was part of the American Classical Studies. I don't know if that was a journal or a series, but volume 21. I'm just looking at the book right now. The subtitle is A Study of Hecate's Roles in Chaldean Oracles and Related Literature. That's what I'm going to get to in a moment. Wikipedia actually has a very good article on Hecate, too, because it pulls from a lot of the primary source material from Pausanias in particular, and Pliny, and some of the writers that we associate with the Middle Platonic and Neoplatonic sort of periods, okay, which are getting more towards the early Christian era as well. Okay, so what's mentioned, I think it's in the Wikipedia article, that as a triple goddess, she was shown in that form after the 5th century BCE. Okay, sculptor Alcamenus portrayed her in this way, similar to the Roman goddess Trivia of the three roads. Okay, with the three heads. And of course, that, again, as I mentioned, that connects her to her liminal function. She was associated previously with doorways, with protection, with keeping things out. And so where three roads meet, you're kind of in a place that's neither, in a way, it's sort of like the two-faced Janus statue. It's kind of both backwards and forwards and perhaps neither here nor there. It's in a place of uncertainty, which road does one take? And I think that Hecate... this is sort of her, this is sort of one of her main connections, as we will see, which connects into her, connects to her association certainly with rites of passages, with both birth and death. Okay, and they note that she's identified with Enodia, a goddess in Thessaly, who is associated with childbirth and other things, but whose name actually means in the road. Okay, so that might that you can see the connection there in terms of the crossroads. And it's pointed out that at least since the 3rd century BCE, okay, that we see a chthonic association with Hecate, okay, with her having to do with witchcraft and chthonic rituals. And specifically what's cited here is the Argonautica, the version that was written in the 3rd century BCE. And of course, the Argonautica is very likely an older epic. Herodotus makes reference to it as something much older in his histories. But certainly the versions that come down to us are from the 3rd century BCE and later. So they're very late writings, relatively speaking. And in the Argonautica, Medea, the witch who is she's really the daughter of the king of Colchis, Aeetes, who falls in love with Jason and ends up murdering her brother and doing, all kinds of things. Medea will be the subject of a podcast at some point. But she is a priestess of Hecate. She's the niece of the goddess Circe or Circe, the one who helps Odysseus in the famous scene in the Odyssey known as the Nicaea, when she tells him how to perform the necromantic rituals to bring Tiresias, to come and, drink from the pool of sacrificial blood that's poured into a pit, and to tell him, what he needs to do to get home. Now, Medea, what Jason needs to do to appease Hecate, as she instructs him to offer the sacrifice, slitting the throat of a ewe, a baby lamb, and then burning it, and then in a pit. Now, mind you, now when you sacrifice things on an altar and burn the offerings to go towards the sky, That tends to be the sacrifice mode for celestial deities associated with the sky and with light. Those that are associated with the chthonic realm under the earth, generally you dig a pit and you make the sacrifice and drain the blood down into the pit. Okay. And so she tells him to do that and to offer a libation of honey and then to retreat from the spot without looking back. Now, this is actually, again, very characteristic of chthonic rituals in general. I mean, whether it's Hecate or whether it's some other kind of certain earth powers or elemental spirits, you make your offering and then you walk away. You don't look back. They also mention that in the later writings of Hermaeus Trismegistus, which is a very sort of, or writings attributed to that figure, which is sort of a very, sort of a legendary or basic early historical esoteric text, okay, magical text that's based on a lot of Egyptian ideas. What its actual source is, it's hard to say, because it does mention the god Thoth and connects him with this Hermaeus Trismegistus figure. Hecate is actually portrayed in these writings as a figure with 3 heads, one of a dog, one of a serpent, and one of a horse. And interestingly, all of these figures are definitely chthonic in nature, because if you remember, particularly with the horse, when we talked about in the Nightmare episode, horses are associated with Poseidon, and Poseidon is the earth shaker and the god under the sea. And of course, the area under the sea also has sort of a chthonic. It's a connection between the chthonic and the upper world. So all of these are, and dogs, of course, we talked about with Hecate, and serpents are very, very clearly associated with, Earth, regeneration and life on Earth. Okay. And they said that sometimes she also is shown with the head of a cow or a boar. Now, her festival in Athens was the Dipnon, which refers to the evening meal, okay? And then we talk about Hecate's suppers. I mentioned that, I think, in the last podcast. And it takes place at the new moon, namely to placate the restless dead. And again, these meals are left at a crossroads. It's worth noting that Rome had very kind of similar rituals regarding the dead and the restless dead. The Lemuria, in particular, was a festival that was held in May. And Ovid, I think, talks about some of these rites, as well as some of the other, there's other fragments from other writers. But the Lemuria festival, again, was meant to one performed certain spells or certain actions or did certain things to keep to appease ancestors and also to keep the restless dead, or a dead that might be angry or have unfinished business sort of away from their house. Okay, so Hecate in Athens was definitely associated with this, and this is at the time of the new moon, which might actually have to do with Hecate's association with the dark of the moon, because of course the darkest point of the moon is just before the light. There's actually another festival that takes place the next day when one sees the first sliver of light of the new moon. I want to say that it's called the Nemona, but I don't have the exact term in front of me at the moment, but I think that's what it's called. And then after that, it's followed by a festival called the Agathos Daemon, which actually means good spirit or good guide. So it's associated with that the waxing moon, with the increase of the moon, which is traditionally, I mean, if you practice magic, that's the time at which to start new ventures. And to get rid of the old and to have new beginnings. It's the death to rebirth kind of a thing of the moon. And the full moon, of course, being the full point at which one is the culmination of what one is working on. And the waning moon is for what you want to get rid of, and traditionally for people who practice such things, for a time of cursing and banishing and doing those kinds of works. Which again, Hecate is kind of right on the line of that. Now, what I found interesting is that Pausanias, who's one of the early writers, I want to say his writings come from roughly the 2nd century. He's kind of one of these writers, again, like Herodotus, that has sort of historical anecdotes that we're not really sure how accurate they are. But he connects the temple of Hecate at Aegina, which I think I had mentioned also in the last episode, that it was founded by Orpheus the Thracian. And that's important to me because Orphism is sort of, just like we talked about Zoroastrianism and Pythagoreanism, Orphism is kind of a movement that comes out of that. And again, it's kind of been described, it's a term kind of like New Age movement, where it describes a variety of different beliefs which may or may not be related to each other and probably also have different forms, okay? But what we think of as Orphism also comes out of this sort of, late classical Hellenistic period. And Orphism significantly is the first place where we start to see this idea of salvation, something like salvation after death. Interestingly, it's either connected with the goddess Demeter and her journey with the god, to find the goddess Persephone and bring her back to the upper world, which again is a death and rebirth image right there. And also the rites of the god Dionysus, that sort of immediate possession of the god and the ecstasy of the Dionysian ritual, which liberates ones from social convention. Okay, so very interesting. These are kind of the first places where we talk about one who being saved or liberated. And in this way, you kind of see that there's sort of a connection between Hecate. There's this. To me, that's another kind of clue to a savior connection for Hecate. So, having said that, I would like to get into that particular aspect, which is known as Hekate Soteria, which is the word Soteria being the word for salvation, the saving Hecate. And again, I'm going to turn to Sarah Iles Johnston here in this work. Let me just give my full sources here. It is, let me find it. Yeah, Sarah Iles Johnston, published by the American Philological Association in 1990. And it's, I'm just looking to see if there's a publisher listed. It just indicates it's part of the American Classical Studies series, probably from the American Philological Society. Scholars Press, Atlanta, Georgia, they're listed as the publisher of this. Okay, so that's the version that I'm looking at and using if you wish to try to acquire this work, either from your library or to purchase it. I think I purchased my copy on Amazon. It's an interesting work if you are interested in Hecate and the scholarship, this sort of transition. And there's Hekate Soteria and there's Hekate Metapsy, okay? It's interesting that we are hosted on a podcast called Metapsychosis, but Metapsy here is used as kind of this... in referring to Hecate as a kind of bridge figure, okay? And we're gonna talk about that. So I'm looking at Sarah Iles Johnston, page 49, where she's talking about the Chaldean oracles. Now, the Chaldean oracles are a group of writings dated from roughly the 6th century BCE to the 3rd century, and, BCE, again, that sort of period. And they're attributed often to Zoroaster. But what they contain is a lot of what is the basis of what we think of as Neoplatonism. Okay, it's these different sayings and things that talk about not only about the nature of the universe and so forth, but also about about the divisions of the heavens and the underworld and about life and death, but also about magic, which at this point takes the form of what they call theurgy. And theurgy has a little bit more to do with it's basically another variety of magic that's different, say, for example, it might be different from herbalism and so forth. It's probably closer to what we tend to think of as traditional magic in terms of the grimoires, or at least the later grimoires, where you have, you're creating sigils and using signs. And there's also a certain amount of sympathetic magic. She makes reference to a thing that looks like a toy called an Inks, Inx, and I think it's IYNX is how you spell it. It's very interesting, and the plural is Ingus. If you want to talk about multiple, and basically it's almost like a kind of a thing, almost like a bull roarer. It's on a string, and you swing it around, and the noise that it makes is supposed to be have something to do with the sound. Is supposed to have to do with the something in tune with the sort of harmony of the spheres, which is a Platonic concept, the idea of the music of the universe or of the soul, and that this was supposed to put one in attunement or alignment with that in one's theurgic, endeavors, we'll call them. So, and again, this is where we sort of also start to get this distinction between sort of high magic and low magic, whether that accurate or not, probably not very accurate. But there's, between the earthly magic and the celestial, that one, they're supposed to be spiritually edifying or to lift you up, as opposed to the things that, perhaps have to do with baser things, and again, there's really there's not a real distinction there. People tend to practice magic for one of two reasons. Well, they practice it because either they're trying to learn something about the secrets of the universe and maybe about themselves, or they're trying to, achieve something in life, and they're trying to direct the energy in their own way. And people have different ways of doing that, and there's, sort of in its own ethical system and morality surrounding that. But that's the kind of the idea. So theurgy kind of falls into this, learning the secrets of the universe and, becoming more spiritual, escaping the worst trappings of death and so forth. The theurgist and becomes this is like the new magician. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in her book. So on page 49, I just want to give you a little introduction from her because it's better than I can say it, I think. She says, the Chaldean oracles were composed towards the end of the Middle Platonic period, at which time ideas about the cosmic soul and its functions were fairly well established. The time of their composition also was one during which Hecate's role as a guide across liminal points was taking on a new philosophical and mystical significance. One way in this significance was expressed was shown in a section entitled The Mistress of the Moon. And she says the Chaldean system was the first to equate soul and Hecate, and she has another chapter which she calls Hekate Metapsi. And she talks about why there, and we're going to go look at that chapter also. So she says, first, she wants to examine in detail the cosmological roles bestowed on Hecate/soul by the oracles. The cosmological roles filled by Hecate/soul can be broken into three categories. First, the transmitter of the ideas and thereby the structurer of the physical world. 2, the dividing bond between this intelligible and sensible worlds, and 3, a source of individual souls and enlivener of the physical world and of man. She says it's artificial to separate these roles sharply, for they are really interrelated facets of a larger one that in the end can be defined only as that of link between the sensible and intelligent realms, between man and God. Okay, and this intermediary thing becomes quite important at this point. So let's see. I just want to look at my notes here because I don't want to get too bogged down in reading all of this, but I do want to get to the important points. Now, if we talk about Hekate Metapsi, the reason that I consider this to be important is because, again, the idea of her as an intermediary, a couple of things happen. We've been talking about Hecate as a chthonic goddess, okay? And what this does is this first of all, it moves the entire, what we think of as the chthonic realm into the sky. And as we'll see, the earth becomes something that's not quite of the same value. It's the spiritual and the celestial that's valued, not the chthonic. The chthonic is something to be kept at bay, to protect yourself from. And so just to read from Isles Johnson again, I'm on page 71, if you happen to have this book. She says, a growing interest in mediating deities and principles in general was growing at this time. As the gods increasingly were portrayed as transcendent, okay, now celestial, away from the earth, not immanent, not part. There's deity as being present here in the world with us and being transcendent. We usually think of deity in the West as transcendent. When you read the Bible story of the Garden of Eden, for instance, Yahweh's transcendent. He transcends our world. Okay, he's not part of nature. Nature is something sort of corrupt. And that is, and there's definitely we're starting to see where this kind of foundation for this way of thinking comes in. As the gods were increasingly portrayed as transcendent, as detached from the world of men, the need for intervening principles or entities increased. Now, we may think of things as, like, for example, angels or guardian angels, okay? But this was now becoming a concept. It wasn't, there was such an idea as the daemon, okay, sort of an intermediary spirit. But now this was becoming a much more widespread idea, I guess, and much more, I don't know if I want to say mainstream, but certainly the oracles make a lot of use of it. Eventually, intermediary entities entered into almost all philosophical or mystical expressions of the relationship between divinity and humanity, as they did in the relationships between other opposing concepts or entities such as the divided and indivisible or time and eternity. And she says, certainly the Chaldean oracles were the products of a system that utilized Platonic doctrines. Okay, and they mention Hecate because she is one of the deities that is mentioned in the Chaldean oracles. She also mentions the Chaldean Eros, who seems to have grown directly from the Eros of Diotima's speech in the Symposium, okay? And the Chaldean demonic system, which will be discussed, as she puts it, in part 2, okay? Now, she also talks about the variety of Gnosticism. I get a lot of questions when I teach about Gnosticism and what it is. And again, Gnosticism is one of those terms that's used as an umbrella term to discuss a lot of different strands of early Christian thought. But she talks about a variety of Gnosticism promoted by Valentius, okay, the Valentian Gnosticism. Included a deity called Oros, or boundary. When another Gnostic deity, Sophia, okay, who's sort of a common thread here,
intruded disastrously upon the previously transcendent paternal abyss. Okay, when she went to the great, this sort of great fatherly abyss. Oros saved the entire universe from chaotic destruction by his literal intervention. Okay, so when she upset the balance, boundaries needed to be reestablished. Okay, this is actually very consistent with all of mythological and religious thinking. We move from chaos to order. And in order to have order, you have to have boundaries. And boundaries, what sets a boundary? How do you measure a boundary? Well, through a ruler, right? You measure it. Okay, there's a measured limit. This is why the king, by the way, is also referred to as a ruler, the ruler who makes laws. Okay, there's this idea of setting a boundary. Oros represented the separating or delineating side of the cosmic mediator. From what little can be deduced about him, the Christos, the Christ, of Valentian Gnosticism probably was the transmissive principle to help souls ascend. Okay, that's sort of a digression, but you're kind of getting a sense of what this system entails. She then says, by the time of the oracles, philosophers had long felt compelled to retain some of traditional religion's validity by explaining religious truths, quote unquote, in philosophical terms or allegory. Plutarch's treatment of Isis and Osiris is one example of this. Alternatively, philosophy and religion could be combined into more or less harmoniously into a single doctrine. It was during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, as well as anyone can judge, that the group of hymns collected under the term Orphic were first composed. Probably the first thing that impresses the modern reader of these hymns is the vast number of deities and epithets that have been gathered together, but philosophical ideas, which have identified variously as Stoic or Platonic, are also present in abundance. Okay, so this is where we're seeing philosophy introduced into religion. Working from the assumption that religion constantly was challenged by Greek philosophy in ways such as those described above, he asks whether religion ever retaliated. His answer is yes. Initially, he notes, and the retaliation arose in foreign religions. And talks about Philo, who was a sort of Hellenistic Jew from this period. He says, as Philo sees it, the Jews are superior to the Greeks, not so much with regard to the result of their pursuit of wisdom as with regard to the sources, human speculation with the Greeks, divine revelation with the Jews, adherents of Moses are the true philosophers. What philosophers acquired through philosophy, Jews acquired through their nusoi kai ethe, through their knowledge and their ethics, okay, or through their. So really, it's sort of like this thing between reason versus revelation, as it were. Okay, so Philo is arguing against this sort of introduction of philosophy, and she says the tide began to turn. True wisdom, in quotes, was asserted to come not from philosophy but from religion, and he says, okay, I'm just going to read this last little bit from this section. Philo and Chaeremon flourished in the 1st century. Scholar Merlin argues that Greek religion itself caught up with the rebellious trend begun by foreign religions in the 2nd century. Its primary weapon, he suggests, was the corpus of the Chaldean oracles. And this is a quote from Merlin, Merlan. In the 2nd century AD, in the Hellenic world, a very strange work originated, pretending to be a collection of oracles, including particularly oracles by Apollo. What strangely philosophic questions it must have been in which the oracle was asked, and what strangely philosophic answers they received. The god who gave them obviously was well acquainted with Platonic and Aristotelian concepts, and had read his Timaeus, another Platonic work, very well, in all likelihood. Also Plato's 2nd and 6th letter. But it was particularly important, these philosophical doctrines are supposed to be found in oracles. They represent divine wisdom. The inference is obvious. Whatever is valuable in Greek philosophy can be found in documents of divine revelation. Obviously, religion is true philosophy. Okay? So now we're getting, and we're also getting this sort of very rational and ethical ideas about religion and about the function of religion, which, as I've mentioned, is previously about appeasing forces. Now it's more about, discovering these kinds of truths. Now let's see. Now how Hecate fits into this. Let me just, I'm reading her section now on theurgy in chapter 6. This has to do with what the Chaldean oracles say about. Now remember, Hecate is associated with dogs, okay? So here it says, in page 87, the Chaldean system warned against reliance on the chthonic daemons, called by the oracles dogs. Okay, so that's interesting. That traditional magic made use of by the theurgist, instead was to be aided by the celestial, Platonic, Onyx daemons, that had been dispersed throughout the cosmos by the paternal intellect. Again, the theurgist was advised to trust in what God gave, not in his own skills alone. Okay, so she talks about theurgy in terms of being not working upon the gods, but being worked on upon by the gods. Okay, so there's this idea now. At this point, now this is kind of sets the tone for the separation of Hecate, who, remember, they identify with the world's soul. With this kind of saving figure who's a bridge. Okay, remember, she's associated with Crossroads. She's a bridge between, for the soul into the higher realms, which, by the way, was associated with the moon. It's, this kind of sets up the separation of her from the chthonic, because the chthonic obviously was not part of the higher realms, the air, the intellect, the celestial. Okay. Now, Sarah Iles Johnson also talks about the idea of an epiphany. Now, epiphany is kind of, I define epiphany a little bit differently than she does. I tend to think of an epiphany as sort of like a kind of aha moment, as it were. It's like where one, is sitting and it's usually not in a very rational way. Like you could just be listening to a piece of music, for example, or just observing something when all of a sudden sort of like a truth comes to you. She defines epiphany a little bit differently. She says epiphanies represent the overstepping of a boundary. Something foreign intrudes into the mortal, which I guess you could say it's like a divine inspiration, into the mortal earthly sphere, which cannot contain a god easily. The very presence of a god immediately causes the ground to shake, the tides to exceed their normal limits, the atmosphere to bristle with lightning and thunder. The idea behind this point was important to Greek religious thought in general, and particular to the Chaldean system, to later Platonism, and to magic. The universe was divided in distinct physical and hierarchical zones, each with its appropriate inhabitants. The gods were divine and belonged on Olympus, or later times above the moon. Men were mortal and belonged on Earth, or belonged below the moon. Crossing these zones' boundaries was in some cases desirable. For example, the theurgist strove to send his soul out of the sensible realm. But in all such cases, a hierarchy was overturned, resulting in a temporary disturbance of the universe's normal workings. Okay? That again is a very important point to consider. This idea of transcending. So now we're talking about this idea. The theurgists are certainly, talking about, being able to transcend what's normal for ordinary mortals. The Gnostics kind of had this idea as well. Okay. My notes next point me to page 134 here, about the Chaldean daemon dogs. Okay, I want to talk about this a little bit because now we're going to get into the separation of Hecate into two. Several oracle fragments mention daemons called dogs, quoted in order, and this is from the Chaldean oracles. Translated, for indeed from the womb of the earth rush forth earthly dogs that never reveal a true sign to mortal man. Okay, and then just to skip over, for it is essential that you do not regard these, and she interpolates dogs, before you initiate your body. For being earthly, difficult dogs, they are shameless, and charming souls, they constantly drag them away from the rights. Okay, so this idea of the dog, first of all, be connected with the earthly and the chthonic. And also with a being that I mistakenly in the last one was referring to Cistus. It's just I'm getting my letters mixed up in my mind. I'm actually referring to Physis. Now, Physis is a nature goddess. Okay, is sort of the goddess of the material world, as it were, in this particular Neoplatonic system. And Physis in this system now. Hecate, it said that, let me just find my particular thing here. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, the Physis is now considered to be the negative aspect of Hecate, so let me explain that. First, she says, from early times, Hecate was associated with phantasms, apparitions, marginal creatures who wandered with her usually at night. Some merely frightened men, others were imagined to bring bad dreams, illness, or madness. Okay? Although it is difficult to discern the exact identity of these creatures, it can be said that they are of generally a daemonic nature. Now, daemon, not demon, daemon, okay? Just want to distinguish here. Daemon is an intermediary spirit. For like daemons, they are liminal, neither man nor god, and like daemons, they interact with man. At least by the time of the Greek magical papyri, and probably earlier, Hecate's swarm of demonic creatures clearly is identified with the restless dead, disembodied souls who are trapped between the upper world and Hades, who carry out the magician's curses or desires, okay? Because they're restless, the magician feels that if they can make a pact, they can offer something to help the restless spirit, that the restless spirit helps them, okay? Or that they could be controlled because they're not in a place of control. Okay. After philosophy became interested in daemons as mediating creatures, Hecate sometimes was portrayed as their mistress and as the mistress of disembodied souls, in great part by virtue of her own mediating nature. Okay? These daemons could be bad or good, intent either on carrying out God's wishes or deceiving men. Later, some systems began to call the good daemons angels or inges and retain the name daemon only for the bad. Okay, so now we're starting to see where we get the idea of a daemon being a demon instead. At the time the Chaldean oracles were composed then, Hecate generally was associated with daemons who were mediators, but who could be good or bad. These were imagined to dwell between heaven and earth in the sublunar region, but she also continued to be associated with bad chthonic daemons or apparitions who emerged from the infernal regions to terrify and harm men. In fact, in other contexts, such as the magical papyri of Greco-Roman poetry, this side of her personality had grown ever more prominent. In adopting Hecate as its cosmic soul, a celestial entity removed from the turmoil and pollution of Earth, Chaldean system had to rid her of her undesirable threatening traits, including her role as mistress of the bad daemons. As it happened, Middle Platonic philosophy conveniently provided a means to do this. Some Platonists posited a double soul, the upper half of which remained secluded from the sensible world, and the lower half which came into contact with men and the Hylic sphere. Justification for this could be found in certain remarks in Plato. Through the efforts of this irrational soul, the sublunar physical world operated. At least as early as Plotinus, possibly earlier, this lower soul was identified with Aristotle's Physis. Okay, so now we're to Physis. Chaldean system had a Physis too. Our character agrees with that of the Platonic irrational soul. So to read from the fragment 70, tireless Physis rules the cosmoi and the works, so that the sky might run, dragging out its eternal course, and the rapid sun might go, as usual, around its center. Like the Platonic irrational soul, the Chaldean Physis ruled the cosmoi, the planets, and the works, the operations of the physical universe. However, they also say, do not invoke the self-manifesting image of Physis, and if she does happen to manifest, do not look at Physis, for her name is like fate. Okay? So why? Well, what's fate? Well, fate is the normal thing that we get involved in life, we engage in life, we are happy, we are sad, we engage in physical pleasures. The idea was that you were supposed to transcend all of these, and this is not a new concept for people who are spiritual seekers. I'm going to transcend all the temptations and sufferings of the body, which actually, well, I don't know. I personally think it's just kind of ridiculous. We spend most of our times trying to not live our lives, but that's just an aside. So she says, if Platonic irrational soul is the lower half of the cosmic soul, then is Chaldean Physis really Hecate's soul? Okay. And so the answer here we seem to see in another oracle, boundless Physis is suspended from the back of the goddess, meaning Hecate. The fragment does not equate her with Physis, however, it makes them separate entities, one of who hangs from, that is, dependent on the other. Okay. So she points out, though, Physis was not so much evil as she was simply Hylic, involved with the functioning of the material world. Now, here's where we start to see this notion of the material world becoming evil, which kind of probably reaches its peak in the Cathar heresy that the church put down, probably, I guess, around the 1200s AD. In which the idea that all matter was evil. And this is where we actually get a lot of our ideas of devil and Satan as sort of this manifestation of material temptation and being dragged down to some horrible fate. Because we have this, this idea that anything having to do with the physical world is sinful, okay? She says, but any system such as the Chaldean that preached the denial of the material as a means to salvation could not help find in her a dangerously disruptive goddess. Okay, so I want to compare that too. In my notes, I say I sort of compare this to Proverbs 5, where they talk about these kinds of things like the seduction of what they call either a loose or a foreign woman, depending on the translation, who will drag one down to Sheol, which of course is the pit, which is the traditional underworld, not the celestial one. Okay, and so you can see too where you even though we see Philo's assertion about the difference between Jewish religion and the philosophers, but you can see also these points where they end up merging into a philosophy that's sort of accepted as a later narrative. Okay, so okay, I have so this celestial Hecate who's being separated from the earth. It says the oracle. This is Sarah Iles Johnston again, just to be clear, page 141, the oracle portrays a Hecate who has been syncretized with several other deities, Phoebe or Selene, the moon, Eileithyia, who's the birth goddess, and perhaps Artemis. But it also separates a celestial Hecate from the darker side of her traditional nature. Hecate says that she herself wanders through the heavens, appearing in fiery, ethereal forms, or flies through the air in a silvery chariot, i.e. the moon. It is the earth, on the other hand, who restrains and guides the dogs normally associated with her. Okay? So I talk a lot about there being a split. And I'm not the only one. I mean, a lot of magicians or practitioners who are kind of looking back to traditional practices, Jake Stratton-Kent comes to mind, talks about this idea of moving the chthonic to the celestial and the kind of disruption that causes. Okay. I have some final notes here. I kind of want to finish up because boy, does time go by fast. And I think this, in just to avoid rambling on too many digressions, I kind of want to make some of these last few points. Okay, so again, just finishing up with Sarah Iles Johnston. I'm looking at page 145 now. She says, okay, bottom of 144, she was a birth goddess and she was a death goddess, accompanying souls on their two greatest journeys. Those souls who did not succeed in making the transition in or out of the body, however, were eternally under her control, forced to wander with her. So this is where we have the idea of the Aore sort of wandering in the underworld with either Hecate or the Furies, right? Many magical acts depended on these wandering souls or daemons. For example, from the 5th century onwards, cursed tablets were placed in graves and other places where souls would be expected to linger. In particular, they were placed in the graves of children, whose souls, as Aore, would be expected to linger between life and death longer than normal. The soul was expected to carry the curse to the chthonic daemons or deities who would enforce it. Okay, so the soul becomes the intermediary there. Disembodied souls or daemons were the magician's tools. Their ability to travel between the worlds enabled them to make good his requests, their unsettled status to put them at his mercy. Okay? And she notes on 147, before the emergence of theurgy, magicians sought the help of such chthonic daemons and disembodied souls. Magic was largely a chthonic art, okay? Dealing with the earth, with calling up spirits of the earth, and also with making use of sort of the pharmacon, the natural knowledge of herbs and plants and things of the earth. Theurgy, however, placed the power of the magician sought in the celestial realm. Okay, so we see this magic is sort of the basis of modern religion in this sense, and science, at least this sort of Platonic bent to it, because it has to do with this plumbing into the depths, to rising above what the ordinary mortal, and maybe perhaps emphasizing the divine nature of the mortal, or the part that can be saved, which that's a very Orphic idea, the idea that mortals come from the ashes of the Titans who had killed and consumed Dionysus, and Dionysus in this Orphic cosmogony is a savior figure. He's supposed to be the successor to Zeus. The Titans are jealous. They kill him, cook him, and eat him. He's saved by Athena, and he's resurrected. Wonder when that happens. I think I've said this before. And then Zeus reduces the Titans to ashes with a thunderbolt in anger, and out of those rise mortals who have the quote-unquote wicked nature of the Titans, but also that have the divine spark of Dionysus in them. Okay, so this is the idea of cultivating the divinity in people. It's a nice idea, but it has its drawbacks. And one of the things that I argue in my book that actually should be out today, I think I saw Amazon pre-orders are being filled today, for Death and the Maiden, the curious relationship between the fear of death and the fear of the feminine. That is something that I focus on, is this, this kind of way in which what appears to be a very good thing, the idea of introducing reason and order and logic and salvation into all of this, the way that, we've not considered the consequences, what the negative consequences of that might be. And as I've always said, I feel it's the feminine side of things. It's the earth. It's the chthonic. We wonder today why we have such a crummy attitude towards the earth. There's this kind of attitude like either we have dominion over it or God's going to save it or whatever. There's this kind of a very dismissive attitude that's embedded in kind of Western consciousness. So to me, it is not surprising when people kind of go, oh yeah, well, it's just, we're at a time of crisis when sustainability of life on the planet may be something going away, and we tend to take a very cavalier attitude towards it because we don't, we have a kind of core belief somewhere in our unconscious cultural narrative, you might say, that comes out of this, that somehow debases the earth as something to be transcended. Okay, so that's something to think about. It's not that, striving towards intellect and I don't know, reaching your potential is a bad thing. It's not. But at the same time, consider what the consequences are of that way of thinking. There really needs to be a balance. Okay, so that is all I'm going to say on Hecate. For now, it's possible that in the future there could be yet another episode on Hecate, because there's probably plenty more to say about her, certainly about her later associations with witchcraft and so forth. But for now, we're going to stop there and take a little bit of a turn, as I'd mentioned earlier in the episode. Once again, want to plug Chthonia.net, which has all my podcasts plus all of my other projects and work. I also, like I said, offer readings. I'm also starting a holistic practice. Doing Reiki in my own modalities. I have my own version of Reiki that I do. I mean, it's Reiki, right? Like anybody else's Reiki, but I have my own modalities. I'm doing what I call crisis Reiki, for dealing particularly with shadow and crisis, which most systems do not deal with this. They deal with, they're just kind of dealing with positive thinking and changing your thoughts and that and purifying and that sort of thing. And my view on that is quite different, and I don't feel it actually helps you in a crisis. So my focus is more on crisis, and I'm going to have more on that. Also, you can visit metapsychosis.com/series/Chthonia. All the episodes are there as well. You can subscribe on iTunes or Google Play if you don't already, and I think Spotify has it as well. And you can... and then, and also if you are interested in contributing to my projects, which I would very much like, I'd like to be able to devote more of my time to this, and to my other related, not only writing projects, but to classes and doing other things. There'll be a new class, by the way, starting this fall. I'll have more information about that on Chthonia.net and on Metapsychosis. I'm going to be, if you want to donate to my project and sustaining a lot of this work, my patreon.com/Chthonia. And all the links, of course, if you're watching the YouTube version, I present all the links at the end. So, and those who are my patrons, again, big thank you, for your continued support. And, with that, we will, talk in the next episode.